Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Tech Tuesday webinar series. Today, I'm joined by Clint Adkins, our Azure Practice Director, and today he's going to be going over the 5 key steps to your success in Azure migration strategies. But before I turn it over to Clint and have him walk you through the presentation he's prepared today, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you do have any questions, please go ahead and enter those into the chat. We will be getting to those towards the end of the webinar. Additionally, if you do have questions that we don't have that come up afterwards or that we don't have time to get to at the end, you can also send those in to us at inquiry@coretek.com or just reply to the email when we send out the recording as well, in case you're viewing it on demand. And that brings me to the next item, which is, as a reminder, we will be sending out a recording of today's webinar following its completion. That way, in case whether you are here and want to refer back to the presentation, or if you registered in advance knowing you weren't going to be able to make it today, we want to make that available to you on demand. So without any further ado, that takes care of all the housekeeping items. Clint, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you run us through the presentation you've prepared for today.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you all for spending time with us today as we talk through Coretek's 5 key steps to your successful Azure migration. So before we get started, one of the key things I always like to do is make sure we all are speaking the same language. And as you're starting to get into Azure migrations and looking at cloud migrations in general, you start hearing some common terms, and we're going to go over a couple of them real quick. Won't spend a ton of time on them, but it's important for you really to understand what terminology is being used and what that means and what impacts that has to you long term. So as we start on the left, we've got a traditional on-prem infrastructure, something where you're supporting the entire data center, or maybe you have a colo or something along those lines, but ultimately you're responsible for that entire stack of services, from networking, storage, servers, the virtualization layer, all the way up to the OS and the applications and all the data. You as the user of the services responsible for that. And then if we go all the way over to the right, we've got software as a service, where you're presented the software to utilize however you want to from a configuration and functionality perspective, but the vendor is actually responsible for keeping the actual applications running and all the data all the way through it. And so things like that are Office 365. So think about Exchange Online or SharePoint Online or Teams or something along those lines, where you're able to fully use the applications, but you're not responsible for keeping that infrastructure up and running. And you have, if you go just slightly to the left, we go platform as a service. Basically what that is that in a cloud infrastructure world, platform as a service and software as a service is really your utopian view of getting the most simplified management and generally speaking, the most uptime for your organization as a whole. So as you develop new service offerings and applications inside your organization, if you're building them yourself, you typically want to build leveraging platform services or PaaS services inside of Azure. That way, all you're managing is your application and your data. And you don't have to manage all the server infrastructure below. IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, the cloud provider, in this case Azure, manages the data center, all of the networking, all of the storage, all the server, and all the virtualization of all the core infrastructure. And then you're responsible for managing the operating system, middleware, data, applications, and whatnot. So hopefully this helps at least explain from a high level of what IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, software as a service, is for you. So customers often ask us how to approach cloud migrations and how to get started. These are some of the top questions we see time and time again. And hopefully today we'll be able to answer these questions for you, at least give you starting points to be able to approach those for your organization. So as we get going, always from a foundational perspective, you always have people, process, and technology. And some of the key things I would comment about this as you're thinking about an Azure migration is, from a people perspective, you're really enabling your technology team to do more. And part of that has to make sure that you have a good skilling plan specifically for your employees. What do you want them to do, and what do you want them to focus on delivering value for you? What's that skilling plan look like? And then from a process perspective, it's so important for Azure migrations to be really successful is to have that good business case and executive sponsor. And we'll dive into that a little bit later throughout this presentation. And from the technology perspective, make sure you're getting the most out of the technologies you're using, that you've chosen to use for the Azure implementation, but also balance that and be careful of not trying to boil the ocean and trying to do too much and completely transform everything that you are through this process. So there's definitely a balance with that as well. There are 4 primary different cloud migration strategies. You have rehost, refactor, re-architect, or rebuild when you're migrating to Azure. And really, if you're just entering into Azure migrations, typically you really are going to be looking at a rehost migration, which is basically taking the infrastructure you have, the servers you have, and moving them up into Azure in a secure and controlled, methodical approach, and then allowing you to do more with it as you go. And we'll get into that here a little bit more in this presentation as well. But other things to look at is things like refactoring. So taking SQL servers, and instead of having physical SQL servers running in Azure like an IaaS or virtual servers, having PaaS services running, so like an Azure SQL database PaaS service or Azure SQL managed instance PaaS service. Other examples of that are web applications. So running Azure application services instead of running IaaS on your infrastructure. There are definitely some good use cases to refactor even as you're migrating also. Re-architecting is really transforming your application to truly be a modernized application and take advantage of your entire, or of all the different new cloud functionality that exists today. And then rebuilding is really writing truly new code with all 100% serverless infrastructure with Azure App Functions and message queues and all sorts of other things to rebuild your application to have it be 100% just cloud native and not using any sort of IaaS services. So Coretek's cloud migration methodology is pretty simple. We've broken it down to 5 key phases of assess, plan, migrate, manage, and optimize. And during the assessment phase, you're really going through and doing a cloud economic assessment or some sort of a financial TCO evaluation to make sure and understand the cost of you running in Azure. And so some of the key things we hit during that phase is looking at what are your motivations? Why are you actually moving to Azure? What's your business reason behind it? Is it because you're trying to get out of the data center business? Or it could be multiple things, right? Are there mergers and acquisitions? It's a big one we see that's happening. Could be end of support for different infrastructure or technology. Server 2008 has extended support. I think there's another 2 years or so left on it. if you move it to Azure as is without any additional cost. But it also could be infrastructure, like your storage, your SAN is at end of support, or your servers are at end of support. It could be something along the lines of looking for pure cost savings and reducing your complexity of your environment. That may be a reason to be looking at moving to Azure. Innovation, that's a big one we see, where people want to be able to innovate and be quicker to market with different solutions. So that could be as easy as you're a service organization of some kind, and anytime you have a new customer, you have to spin up new infrastructure for them. And you need to do that in a more agile, quicker way. You can definitely do that by leveraging Azure. The other thing to really understand is, what are the outcomes that you're trying to do, you're trying to accomplish during your migration to Azure? Are you looking truly at financial outcomes, agility outcomes, reach outcomes, trying to connect with people, customer engagement, or performance outcomes, or is it a little bit of all of them? And how do you actually measure success? And really think about that as you're going into this ahead of time, so you know if you're successful based on the migration itself. Over time, that will continue to change and transform, but it's a good idea to really understand that as you're planning your fiscal year budgets and your fiscal year objectives, so that you can make sure that you're truly getting the expected results from your cloud environment that you plan. An Azure economic assessment ultimately goes through, and we use different tool sets. There are a lot of them out there, but you can use Azure Migrate is a free tool that's available that you can download yourself. We primarily use a couple different tools, Stratazone being one, Block 64, and we've recently really switched to Movere as our primary tool of choice. But ultimately, what they do is they scan your environment in a non-invasive, non-impactful way to look at what's going on with your infrastructure and understand really the real-time performance utilization of that infrastructure. Picture like another monitoring tool out there, so that we can look at what you're running today and what that would look like running in Azure. And typically we'll do things like look at what applications are running and what applications are talking to each other and things like that. But ultimately what you get out of this is you get the ability to really understand what your environment's doing today and what it would look like if you were running it in Azure and what that cost would be. Typically, these engagements are give or take 6 to 8 weeks. It really depends on the size of your environment. It definitely can be quicker if needed, but generally we like to have the tools running for at least 2 weeks. So that we can make sure and get the most accurate information about resource utilization and optimization overall. Once you've gone through the cloud economic assessment and the assess phase, and you really understand what your financial costs would be and what infrastructure capabilities there are by moving to Azure, and assuming that makes sense, then we move into the plan phase. And during this, we focus on something called Cloud Adoption Framework, or CAF. And ultimately, what that does is it's a standard methodology to implement, manage, and govern an Azure environment. And we'll get into that a little bit deeper. But other things you'll want to do is you'll want to look at identifying application dependencies, any sort of PaaS workloads plans that you're planning on doing, if you're doing it as part of it, and then obviously building your security plan overall. So going a little bit deeper from a Microsoft CAF or cloud adoption framework, there's a lot of great tools out there. If you go to azure.com/CAF, you can find a lot of great information on this. But fundamentally, there are 6 key areas that are focused on from a CAF perspective. And this is really setting up your organization for success long term. So defining your strategy, really understanding, we talked about understanding those motivations and outcomes. And as you build your actual business justifications and your project priorities, and then transitioning into the CAF plan phase where you're really going in and understanding your digital estate. So think about that cloud economic assessment we just talked about, where you're going through and you're actually analyzing what's going on in your environment, what are you using, and how much data is there, and what that would look like. Looking at your organizational alignment and skills readiness plan. So mapping out what should your organization look like with you being a cloud or an Azure-based organization. And then actually building out a formal adoption plan. And that sounds really complicated. It really isn't. It's really identifying what workloads need to move, what outcomes are expected, and then who the key stakeholders are that need to be involved as part of that. And then jumping into the ready phase. And the ready phase is really the technical design side of things. So making sure that the landing zone or the Azure subscriptions and environments are all designed properly, including, what kind of Azure environment are you procuring? Are you looking at what's your subscription management plan? What's your identity management plan? Your networking connectivity plan? What's your governance standards for types of infrastructure you can leverage and where infrastructure can be deployed? What your tagging plans are? And I know there's a lot more out there too, but from a really high level, designing what does that Azure environment look like, and actually building that initial landing zone. So what firewalls are you using? Are you going to use Palo Altos? Are you going to use an Azure firewall? Or are you going to use just standard controls within Azure to secure that environment? And there's a lot of different conversations around that design, those design decisions. But I definitely recommend you engage someone, whether that's Coretek or another partner, to walk you through that and make sure you're getting the right design out of your environment. It's really important to get that up front done properly. You can also go into, once you have your landing zone actually built and ready to deploy infrastructure to it and applications and data, you can go into the adopt phase. And in this purposes of today's conversation, we're really talking about a data center migration. And we'll get into a little bit more information on what our exact approach is for the migration here in the next phase of our Coretek discussion. But ultimately, it gives you the ability to truly identify migrations and innovation plans. And then ultimately, this CAF gives you your governance plan, as well as how are you managing your environment. From an Azure perspective, I mean, just bottom line is Azure has an unmatched security compared to anything else, any other cloud providers out there, and chances are, in a lot of cases, better than your own data centers. Just fundamentally, Microsoft invests. I mean, they spend over $1 billion a year in securing their Azure infrastructure. And really what it boils down to is if there was ever major breaches from an Azure perspective, that'd be a major problem for them, or from an AWS or anything along those lines. So Microsoft invests heavily on their security side. And I can tell you our CISO, our Chief Information Security Officer, was not a Microsoft security-focused individual before coming to Coretek, and as he really got to know the Microsoft security controls and security tool sets that are available, really has become a really big fan. That's not to say that's the only solution out there, and that's not to say that there aren't other tools that work better in specific situations, but generally speaking, the Microsoft security platform is really pretty fantastic. So circling back to the Coretek cloud migration methodology, so after we've built that initial landing zone and that initial CAF design, then we go into migration. So there are different tools you can use for migrations. Microsoft has two primary tools. There's Azure Migrate, and then there's Azure Site Recovery, ASR. So we at Coretek leverage ASR, and the reason why we do is because we have a bunch of built-in scripts and tools to help automate those migrations. And really, we have a migration factory built around it where we can migrate a lot or a little machines pretty easily, working with you in a controlled, secure environment. But ASR, what I really like about ASR is Azure Site Recovery is actually Microsoft's DR tool, and it is the initial way that that Microsoft recommended migrating server infrastructure bit by bit into Azure. And it's a pretty quick, easy, seamless process that allows for failover tests to occur. So we leverage ASR for our migrations overall, and that's in a lift and shift fashion specifically. So really the objective of a lift and shift is to migrate as is as close as possible and migrate it into Azure running virtual servers and with minimal to no code changes at all on the application. That's really the objective of it. You know, one of the great things about it is if you can run a VM, there's a very good chance that it will run, if you're running a VM on-prem, there's a very, very, very strong likelihood that it will run in Azure. There are some questions on support and how to get it into Azure to run properly, but during that cloud economic assessment, one of the key things that's identified is any sort of potential blockers for the migrations that you have to address. So things like a really large disk is enabled. Well, you can work through that. You just have to plan your migration properly and your rehost migration properly to control that. We personally like to use a 5-week migration process. You can use whatever kind of process you want to do as you're going into migrations. Some of the key things that we do is we use a T- schedule. So we have T-3 is 3 weeks out from actual migration day. T-2 is 2 weeks out. T-1 is 1 week out. T-0 is the week of the migration for the particular server group that's being migrated. And then T+1 is the week after. And it's just an easy way to understand it. So you can say we're in week T-2 for this group. And that way, what you can do is you can say, oh, in T-2, we're supposed to be, from a project management perspective, we're supposed to be in build, test, plan, and submit change control. So if we don't have a change control submitted for that workload to be migrated by the end of week 2, T-2, we're behind schedule. So it's a good way to control it, but ultimately communicate, build your test plans and submit your change controls, actually go through and test applications and remediate anything. Keep in mind, we're moving it as is with limited to no code change. So assuming you do your planning properly and everything, you won't have issues during that test phase. We do recommend it just because you can have certain things, but just in case. But generally speaking, it's a really pretty solid, easy process for you to go through. Other things to look at is making sure you have a good go live migration and post migration cleanup checklists, and then transition to your cloud maturity model and your overall support process and what that looks like for your organization. Really, one of the great things about this is you really truly can move just about any workload that's running up in Azure. Definitely check out the Azure Migrate page at azure.com/Azure-migrate, and that will get you more information on exactly what can move and what risks you could. Once we've done the actual migration, then we transitioned into managing and having true 24/7 monitoring. And that could be, again, whether you're doing it as your organization or you're using a company like Coretek to do it. Either way, use ITIL-based service delivery and use as much automation and Azure DevOps as possible. So as you're going through your migration, make sure that's part of the plan, is to ensure you're set up with that for long-term success. I'd also highly recommend that you set up a cloud center of excellence, depending on the size of your organization, of course, but the idea behind a cloud center of excellence is really to have standards set organizationally so you can ensure that you guys are getting the most out of cloud while enabling as many of your employees as possible, but still governing and controlling it. So part of the Cloud Center of Excellence job duties typically are overall governance and oversight and making sure that things like spend is under control and ensuring that your policies and your securities are automatically configured properly. Some other key things to look at are governance, and really governance from a Azure perspective really is around 5 key areas. So you've got cost management, security baseline, resource consistency to ensure uptime, identity baseline, deployment acceleration, and really understanding how can you configure things as quickly as possible. And then once you have your core support set up properly, then going into the optimization. So modernizing your app, looking at cost optimizations, performance optimizations, and long-term security plays. From an app modernization perspective, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. Coretek does have an app modernization methodology, and we actually have an engagement to modernize 1 to 5 applications. And we really start out by assessing it and validating its functionality and validating that what the application should be and what an architecture should be for a particular application. And if you are a managed Microsoft account, there's definitely a lot of opportunities for funding from Microsoft for that as well. But the bottom line is continue to evolve and continue to get the most out of your applications that you can. Typically, a app modernization engagement, it depends on the actual application itself, but a normal, simple application usually can be done within 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we look at it as really looking at doing design and architecture review, migration planning and development, making sure we really understand what the end result looks like, and then going through the actual migration of the application. We use a tool called Unified Cloud or Cloud Pilot as our primary tool to analyze the applications. Definitely would recommend you look at it as a tool available if you have in-house developed applications and you're looking to optimize or modernize your your applications in Azure. And how to get started, simply, if you want to get started with Coretek, please feel free, reach out to us at coretek.com/contact, or reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. That's Clint Adkins on LinkedIn. We also have a white paper for you to download. Kevin will be sending out this link as a follow-up, but please feel free to download the Azure migration strategy, which outlines each of these steps a little bit in more detail, something that you can leverage within your organization. All right, Kevin, do we have any questions out there?
We do have a question, and I know we are right at the 2:30 mark, but we will go ahead and address this one here. The question is, Clint, does the connectivity / network become a topic / hurdle with these migrations?
Yeah, great question. It can, but there are a lot of opportunities out there and a lot of options for you to get around it. So Microsoft has tool sets where they can send drives to you, and you can copy drives, disks, and send them up to Azure, physically mail them to Azure if there's some major large data requirements with maybe a pipe that isn't quite as large as that. There are definitely a lot of opportunities. In addition, one of the great things about where things have gotten today is a lot of the standard Azure Migrate and ASR tool sets can do data synchronization, and it copies bit by bit up for virtual machines. And what that can allow you to do is really spread out that migration if there is some bandwidth constraints specifically. It can help you do that in an easier fashion and ensure success still, but maybe limit the bandwidth of what's being consumed during the migration. I have not seen an organization not be able to migrate to Azure because of bandwidth issues. Great question.
Yeah, so that looks to be the only one we have at the moment. Again, we'll be sending out a recording and the presentation, the slide deck here that Clint went over. So again, you'll be able to contact us either by the contact page on our website, or you can reach out directly to Clint on LinkedIn. Those links again will be in the slide deck when we send them out. But yeah, if there are any additional questions, please feel free to reach out and then send those our ways. Always happy to help there. Want to thank everybody for their time today, and thank you, Clint, as well, for walking us through the presentation. I know there was a lot of information there, but I sort of, for myself anyways, the 5-step approach that Coretek takes is a very easy way. I think it makes it very palatable to break it down and see what's sort of included in each stage. So hopefully you all found that to be the same. We will be back next week with another webinar. This one's going to be focused on Azure cost optimization, and Chris Shelda will be joining me for next week's webinar. So you'll be receiving invites for that shortly. Until next week, though, that'll do it for us today. Want to thank you again for taking the time to watch with us today. Recordings will be hitting your inbox either this afternoon or tomorrow morning, depending on when everything becomes available on the back end. And we look forward to catching you during the next webinar. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.